It starts with a vibration in the soles of your boots. You are standing on the muddy bank of the Ocmulgee River, deep in the Georgia woods. It is 3 in the morning. The air is heavy, thick with the smell of wet earth and decaying pine needles. It is silent, the kind of silence that presses against your eardrums. Then, the tremor moves up your legs. The water in the river begins to ripple, though there is no wind. And then you hear it. It's not the low rumble of a modern diesel engine. It is a high, shrieking hiss. The sound of water hitting superheated iron. The sound of a steam engine pushed beyond its limit. A light cuts through the river fog. It is blindingly white, searing, swinging wildly back and forth. The screech of metal grinding against metal fills the valley, loud enough to make you cover your ears. You see the massive black shape of a locomotive, smoke pouring from its stack, hurtling out of the darkness at 50 miles per hour. You flinch. You brace for the wind of its passing, but the wind never hits you, because the train isn't on the ground. It is hovering 10 feet in the air, tracing the path of a bridge that burned down during the administration of Abraham Lincoln. And then comes the sound that locals in Macon try to ignore every April. It's the sound of wood splintering like matchsticks, the groan of twisting steel, and finally, a splash so loud it sounds like a cannon shot, followed by the instant, boiling hiss of a boiler exploding underwater. Then, silence. The light is gone. The ripples in the river settle. You are alone in the dark again. This is not a scene from a horror movie. This is a documented phenomenon reported by fishermen, hikers, and railroad engineers for over a century and a half. They call it the ghost train of Macon. But this isn't just a campfire story to scare teenagers. The train was real. The men inside it were real. And the cargo they were carrying was supposed to save a dying nation. Official records say it was a tragic accident, a derailment caused by rain and speed. But if you dig a little deeper, if you look at the cargo manifests that were supposed to be destroyed, you realize that the ghost story might be the only honest thing about this entire event. Because when the rescue crews arrived the next morning to pull the bodies from the river, they found the wreckage. They found the dead. But they didn't find the gold. Millions of dollars in Confederate bullion vanished into the mud that night. And for 160 years, people have been trying to find it. Some lost their fortunes. Some lost their minds. And some, if the legends are true, lost their lives to the very thing guarding that riverbed. But to understand why this train still runs in the dark, we have to go back to the night it stopped forever. April 14th, 1864. To understand the sheer panic of this night, you have to understand the world in which it happened. The American Civil War had been raging for 3 years. The South was not just losing, it was suffocating. Imagine a world where money has lost all meaning. In Macon, Georgia, a single pound of coffee costs $70. A pair of boots costs $200. The Confederate dollar is collapsing so fast that shopkeepers change their prices 3 times a day. And looming over everything is a name that terrified every man, woman, and child in Georgia. General William Tecumseh Sherman. His Union army was gathering like a storm cloud just north of them. Everyone knew what was coming. He wasn't just coming to fight armies, he was coming to burn cities. Atlanta was the target, but Macon, a critical railroad hub just 80 miles south, was dangerously exposed. In the middle of this chaos, a secret order came down from Richmond. The Confederate treasury, or at least a significant portion of its remaining hard assets, had to be moved. We aren't talking about paper money. Paper money was trash. We are talking about gold bullion, silver coins from the New Orleans Mint, and jewelry donated by wealthy families to the war effort. Estimates vary, but historians suggest the value on that train was between $2 and $5 million in 1864 currency. Adjusted for inflation, that is purchasing power in the hundreds of millions. But in the middle of a war, it was worth even more. It was the only thing that could buy guns, medicine, or foreign support. It was the last heartbeat of the Confederacy. and they decided to put it all on a steam train in the middle of a thunderstorm. The scene at the Macon depot was frantic. Witness accounts describe a night of torrential rain. The mud was ankle-deep. The station was swarming with soldiers, but they weren't marching. They were guarding. Bayonets fixed, eyes scanning the shadows. A train waited on the tracks. It wasn't a sleek military transport. It was a patchwork beast, an older locomotive pulling a string of mismatched boxcars and a single passenger coach. Under the flickering light of oil lanterns, men struggled with wooden crates. These weren't standard army rations. You can tell a lot by how a man lifts a box. If it's full of uniforms or hardtack, you can swing it onto your shoulder. But these crates? It took 4 grown men to lift a single box 2 feet off the ground. Their boots slipped in the mud, their muscles strained. The wood groaned under the density of the contents. They were loading gold, tons of it. But here is the detail that makes this story transition from history into mystery. If you looked at the station logbook that night, you wouldn't see gold or treasury written anywhere. The station master, perhaps under orders, or perhaps trying to pull a fast one, recorded the shipment as nails, agricultural hardware, and lead shot. It was a brilliant cover. Who would rob a train full of nails? But deception has a price. By mislabeling the weight, they created a physics problem. The engineer, a man named Elias Thorne, looked at his manifest and saw a heavy load, but a manageable one. He didn't know that the specific gravity of gold is almost twice that of lead. He didn't know that the center of gravity in those boxcars was deadly low and incredibly dense. He was driving a train that was significantly heavier than he was told. As the final crate was shoved on board, the rain intensified. Thunder rattled the station windows. It was an omen, if there ever was one. The whistle blew, a lonely, mournful sound that cut through the storm. The wheels slipped on the wet iron rails, spinning for a few seconds before finding traction. Slowly, painfully, the train lurched forward. It left the safety of the Macon lights and headed north toward the Ocmulgee River. The cargo was a lie, and the train carrying it was a death trap. We need to talk about the machine itself. When we think of trains today, we think of smooth, silent electric rails or massive diesel freighters that can plow through anything. We trust them. But a Civil War-era steam locomotive was a completely different animal. It was a mechanical nightmare held together by rivets and hope. The engine pulling the gold that night was a 440 American type. Imagine a 25-ton iron kettle boiling water at high pressure, mounted on wheels that are essentially just steel hoops. Inside the cab, it is a vision of hell. It is incredibly hot. The firebox, where the fireman is shoveling coal non-stop, is burning at over 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. The radiant heat singes the hair on your arms. The noise is deafening, a constant rhythmic clanking, hissing and roaring that makes conversation impossible. You have to scream to be heard, and visibility? Practically zero. The headlamp on the front of the train wasn't an electric beam that could illuminate a mile of track. It was an oil lamp, a large candle in a glass box. On a clear night, it might cast a dim yellow glow about 50 yards ahead. In a thunderstorm, it was useless. You were driving blind. Elias Thorne, the engineer, stood with one hand on the throttle and the other on the brake lever. He was an experienced railman, but experience can't change the laws of physics. He was running on a schedule that was already broken. The loading had taken too long. They were late. In the railroad business, being late is bad. In war, being late is fatal. If he didn't reach the junction by dawn, he risked crossing paths with Union scouts. He had to make up time. So, he did what any engineer under pressure would do. He pushed the throttle forward. The pistons pumped harder. The steam pressure gauge climbed. The train picked up speed, rattling over the uneven, war-torn tracks. 30 miles per hour. 35. This doesn't sound fast to us. We drive faster in school zones. But on 1860s tracks, which were often just iron strips nailed to rotting wood ties, 35 miles per hour feels like re-entry. The cab shook violently. The floorboards vibrated so hard they numbed the feet. And there was another problem: the brakes. Modern trains have air brakes on every single wheel of every single car. If the engineer stops, the whole train stops. This train had hand brakes. To stop the train, brakemen had to physically run across the tops of the moving, slippery boxcars in the rain and turn a wheel by hand to clamp the brakes down on each car individually. It was a suicide mission in good weather. In a storm, it was impossible. Essentially, once that train got up to speed, it was a runaway projectile. Elias Thorne had almost no way to stop it quickly. He checked his pocket watch, squinting in the dim light of the firebox. He snapped the lid shut. The anxiety in the cab was palpable. Behind him, in the boxcars, sat the Confederate guards. They were sitting on crates of gold, likely thinking about what they would do with their share if the South won the war. They were smoking pipes, playing cards, trying to ignore the lurching of the car. They didn't know that the train was unbalanced. They didn't know the tracks ahead had been soaked by 3 days of relentless rain. Elias Thorne wiped sweat and soot from his forehead. He leaned out of the window, rain stinging his face, trying to see the line. He was approaching the Ocmulgee River trestle, a wooden bridge spanning the dark, swirling waters. He was 5 minutes late. He opened the throttle. He shouldn't have. The journey was only supposed to be a few hours, a mad dash north under the cover of darkness. But as the train left the outskirts of Macon, the landscape changed. The dim lights of the city vanished, and the locomotive plunged into an abyss of pine forests and rolling hills. The storm, which had been a nuisance in town, became a living thing out here. Rain fell in sheets, overwhelming the tracks. Water poured off the hillsides, turning the ditches into muddy torrents. Lightning illuminated the countryside in stark, ghostly flashes, revealing a world of thrashing trees and overflowing creeks. Inside the passenger coach, the mood was grim. A dozen high-ranking Confederate officials and their families were huddled together. They weren't soldiers. They were bankers, politicians, the architects of the war. Now, they were just scared passengers on a rattling, bucking train, praying for the ride to end. Up in the cab, the situation was even worse. Elias Thorne was fighting the machine. Every railroader knows that speed on a curve is dangerous. The centrifugal force wants to lift the wheels off the inside of the track. With a normal cargo, you learn to feel that tipping point. But this was not a normal cargo. The gold, concentrated in heavy crates on the floor of the boxcars, created an unusually low center of gravity. It didn't want to tip. Instead, the immense weight acted like a battering ram against the rails, pushing them outwards. Every time they hit a curve, the rails groaned and spread under the strain. Thorne could feel it in the cab, a sickening sideways lurch that told him the entire track was flexing beneath him. He eased back on the throttle, but the momentum of the train was too great. The wheels screamed, the firebox roared. They were a metal serpent, sliding on a bed of mud and water. And then we get the first piece of testimony that doesn't fit the official narrative. A few miles south of the river, there was a small farm with a crossing. The farmer, a man named Jedediah Blackwood, was woken by the sound of the approaching train. He was a Union sympathizer, and the late-night train traffic made him suspicious. He peered through his window as the locomotive thundered past. In the flash of lightning, he saw two figures silhouetted in the cab. Thorne, the engineer, was a big, broad-shouldered man. He was unmistakable. But next to him, according to Blackwood's later statement to the sheriff, was a smaller, wiry man in a dark coat. This is the problem. The official crew roster for that train listed only 3 men assigned to the engine: Elias Thorne, the engineer, a fireman, and a brakeman who rode in the first boxcar. The fireman was in the cab with Thorne, but he was a known local, a stout man named Miller. The man Blackwood saw was a stranger. Who was he? A Confederate officer overseeing the transport? A Treasury agent? Or was he someone else entirely? The question hangs in the air, unanswered by history. As the train thundered on, the river got closer. The roar of the engine was now competing with the roar of the flooded Ocmulgee. Thorne knew he had to slow down for the trestle bridge. It was old, wooden, and never designed for this kind of weight, especially not in a flood. He reached for the brake, and as they approached the trestle, the farmer, Blackwood, swore he looked back and saw only one man in the cab. The second man had vanished. Then, the world turned to chaos. The oil headlamp finally cast its weak glow on the track just ahead of the bridge. And what Thorne saw must have frozen his blood. The rain hadn't just soaked the ground, it had washed it away. The wooden ties of the track, which should have been supported by a bed of gravel and earth, were hanging in mid-air over a 10-foot gully. The rails sagged under their own weight. It wasn't a damaged track, it was a trap. Thorne yanked the brake lever with all his strength. He threw the engine into reverse. A shower of sparks erupted from the wheels as they locked up. But it was too late. The point of no return had been passed miles ago. The front wheels of the locomotive hit the unsupported section of track. The iron rails bent, twisted, and then snapped. And the train simply gave way. Time slows down. For the men on that train, the next 3 seconds must have felt like an eternity. Imagine you are Elias Thorne. One moment, you are fighting to control a machine. The next, the floor beneath you is gone. There is a sensation of weightlessness, a sickening lurch in your stomach as the 25-ton locomotive pitches forward and down into the abyss. The noise is the first thing that hits you. It's not a single sound, but a symphony of destruction. First, the shriek of the snapping rails, high-pitched, like a metallic scream. Then, the splintering of the trestle bridge. Massive oak beams, a foot thick, shatter like toothpicks under the immense weight. The sound is like a forest of giant trees being felled all at once. The locomotive, now completely airborne, nosedives. Inside the cab, Thorne and his firemen are thrown against the front wall. The firebox door bursts open, vomiting a wave of glowing red-hot coals across the floor. The cab instantly fills with smoke and the smell of burning flesh. But they have no time to scream. Behind them, the tender car, full of 10 tons of coal and water, detaches and slams into the back of the engine, crushing the cab like a tin can. The first boxcar, the one with the gold, follows the engine's path. It tilts, hesitates for a fraction of a second on the edge of the broken bridge, and then plunges. Inside, the Confederate guards are tossed like rag dolls. The wooden crates, each weighing hundreds of pounds, break free from their moorings. They become unguided missiles, sliding across the floor, crushing limbs and pinning men against the walls. The second boxcar slams into the first. The third slams into the second. It's a chain reaction of catastrophic failure. The coupling links between the cars snap one by one, each with a deafening report like a rifle shot. The entire train concertinas, a metal serpent folding in on itself as it falls into the churning black water of the Ocmulgee River. From the riverbank, it would have been a sight of terrible, brief beauty. The firebox, now submerged, cast an eerie, hellish orange glow through the water. A massive cloud of steam and smoke erupted into the night sky, momentarily illuminated by the train's own dying light. The sound wasn't a splash, it was a crunch, the sound of a mountain falling into a lake. The locomotive hit the riverbed with enough force to drive it 15 feet into the mud. The impact sent a shockwave through the water, a wave so powerful it uprooted trees 100 yards downstream. The boxcars followed, landing on top of each other in a tangled, unrecognizable heap of splintered wood and twisted steel. For a moment, there was a strange, gurgling silence. The rain still fell. The thunder still rolled in the distance. But the mechanical roar of the train was gone, replaced by the hiss of cooling metal. Then came the screams. The few men who survived the initial impact were now trapped in a nightmare. They were in total darkness, submerged in cold, muddy water, inside wreckage that was rapidly filling up. They were disoriented, injured, fighting for a pocket of air that wasn't there. But their suffering was about to get much, much worse. Because the physics of a steam engine don't stop just because it's underwater. The fire in the firebox was still burning at 2,000 degrees. The water in the boiler was still pressurized to over 100 pounds per square inch. And cold river water was now flooding into the engine, pouring over the superheated iron of the boiler. Silence followed the crash, but it lasted only a second. Then came the physics of thermodynamics. The boiler of a steam locomotive is essentially a massive pressure cooker. It is designed to contain extremely high temperatures and pressures. The metal is thick, the rivets are immense. But even the strongest metal has its limits. When the submerged engine hit the river, it wasn't just water that rushed in. It was a flood. Cold, dense river water poured into the superheated firebox and over the exterior of the boiler. The temperature difference was astronomical. Think about dropping a frozen turkey into a vat of boiling oil. The sudden cooling caused the boiler's outer metal to contract violently. This created immense stress. Cracks began to form. Tiny fissures at first, almost imperceptible. But the pressure inside the boiler was still building. The fire, though now underwater, was still raging. It heated the remaining water to temperatures far exceeding its boiling point. The pressure rose to critical levels. Then, the weakened metal of the boiler gave way. It didn't explode outwards in a fireball like a bomb. It failed catastrophically inwards. The metal ruptured, and the superheated water and steam inside were instantly released into the surrounding environment. Imagine a million kettles all boiling over at once, but with the force of a depth charge. The result was a localized explosion of unimaginable heat. The water immediately around the boiler was vaporized. Not boiled, but instantly turned into steam, expanding at an incredible rate. This steam expansion propelled fragments of the boiler and locomotive outwards with explosive force. But the true horror was the heat. Anything caught in the immediate blast radius was subjected to temperatures that could instantly flash-boil flesh. For the men trapped in the locomotive cab and the front of the first boxcar, there was no suffering, no scream of agony. It wasn't drowning, it wasn't suffocation, it was instantaneous, atomizing heat. Their bodies were essentially vaporized in a fraction of a second. Think of the footage you see of volcanic eruptions, where the heat wave instantly incinerates everything in its path. This was that, but concentrated and underwater. The shockwave traveled through the water, tearing apart the already mangled train cars and their occupants. It obliterated any hope of survival for those not already killed by the impact. The river, which had been a dark, swirling torrent, was now a churning, hissing cauldron. Steam billowed into the night sky, a ghostly white plume illuminated by the dying embers of the fire. The water itself boiled for several minutes around the wreckage. On the banks, the first witnesses to arrive heard the explosion, felt the tremor. They saw the strange phosphorescent glow beneath the water. They approached with caution, armed with lanterns and ropes, expecting to find injured men. They found pieces. They found fragments of metal. They found shattered wood. They found what looked like shredded cloth. But they did not find recognizable bodies. Not in the immediate vicinity of the engine. When the river finally calmed and the water level receded slightly, the full horror began to emerge. The mangled remains of the train were a chaotic mess of wood and iron. But the cargo was supposed to be the most important thing recovered. When the rescue crews, aided by soldiers from Macon, began the grim task of sifting through the wreckage and pulling the dead from the water, they found them. The bodies of the guards, the officials, the engineers. Many were horrifically mutilated, some boiled beyond recognition. They recovered what they could. They held makeshift funerals on the riverbank. But they didn't find the one thing that mattered, the gold. The morning after the crash, the Ocmulgee River was a scene of controlled chaos. Confederate officers, their faces grim, barked orders. Soldiers formed a tight perimeter, pushing back the morbidly curious locals. The official story was already being crafted, a tragic but straightforward accident. A bridge washed out by the storm. Brave soldiers lost in the line of duty, a terrible loss for the Confederacy. But behind the scenes, a quiet, desperate search was underway. The Treasury officials who had overseen the loading of the train were now wading in the waist-deep, muddy water, their fine uniforms soaked and stained. They weren't looking for survivors. They were looking for their crates. The physics was simple. Gold is one of the densest materials on Earth. It doesn't float. It doesn't dissolve. If the crates shattered on impact, the bullion bars and coins should have sunk straight to the bottom and embedded themselves in the soft riverbed mud. They should have been right there. The soldiers began to dredge the river. They used ropes and grappling hooks, dragging the river bottom in a grid pattern. They probed the mud with long poles. When that failed, they brought in divers, men in heavy canvas suits and brass helmets tethered to air pumps on the shore. These divers walked the riverbed, their boots sinking deep into the silt. They felt with their hands, searching for the unmistakable weight and shape of a gold bar or the sharp edge of a coin. They found nothing. They found twisted pieces of the train. They found personal effects, a pocket watch, a boot, a shattered rifle stock, but not a single ounce of gold. Days turned into a week. The search became more frantic. They brought in barges with dredging cranes, scooping up tons of mud and sifting through it on the riverbank. It was grueling, soul-crushing work. Imagine the paranoia setting in among the Confederate command. Millions of dollars, the financial lifeline of their entire nation, had just vanished. The official reports sent back to Richmond were vague. They spoke of the difficulty of the recovery and the unfavorable conditions of the river. But they couldn't hide the truth forever. The gold was gone. And that's when the questions started to get dangerous. Was it possible the sheer force of the boiler explosion had somehow scattered the gold? Unlikely. The explosion was thermal, not kinetic in a way that could vaporize metal. It might have pushed the bars around, but it wouldn't have made them disappear. Could the river current have carried it downstream? Impossible. Gold is too heavy. A single bar would sink like a stone, even in a flood. This is where the official story begins to fray. The river was dredged. Every inch of mud around the wreck was sifted. Millions of dollars in gold bullion doesn't just float away. The soldiers started whispering among themselves. The locals, kept at a distance, started inventing their own theories. Maybe the Union Army had somehow sabotaged the track and was waiting downstream to collect the prize. But the most dangerous theory, the one whispered only in the most trusted company, was that this was an inside job. Think about it. The manifest was a lie. The weight was misrepresented. C.B. A mysterious, unidentified man was seen in the engineer's cab just before the crash. And now, the most valuable cargo in the South was nowhere to be found. It didn't look like an accident anymore. It looked like the perfect crime. A heist so audacious, so brilliantly executed, that the perpetrators used a catastrophic train wreck as a mere distraction. The investigation was quietly shut down. The official cause of the crash was listed as derailment due to track washout. The missing gold was never mentioned in the final public report. It was a national secret, buried under the larger tragedy of a losing war. The Confederacy couldn't afford the panic that would ensue if the public knew its treasury was empty. So they left. The soldiers packed up their equipment. The officials returned to Macon. They left the mangled corpse of the train to rust in the Ocmulgee River, a silent monument to a secret that was already beginning to fester. And that's when the whispers started. Maybe the gold wasn't lost. Maybe it was stolen. Let's think like a criminal for a moment. If you wanted to steal the Confederate treasury in 1864, you'd have a few problems. First, security. The train was swarming with armed guards. A direct assault would be a suicide mission. Second, logistics. Gold is heavy, absurdly heavy. You can't just throw a few sacks over your shoulder and ride off into the night. You'd need wagons, mules, and a team of men to move it. An operation that large would be impossible to hide. So, a conventional robbery is off the table. You need something more elegant, more deceptive. This is where the second man in the cab becomes the key. Let's call him the architect. He's not just a common thief. He's someone with inside knowledge. He knows the train's route. He knows its schedule. And most importantly, he knows its cargo. Who could he be? A disgruntled Confederate officer? A Treasury agent playing a double game? A Union spy with more on his mind than just intelligence gathering? We'll never know for sure, but let's follow his plan. His first move is to ensure the manifest is falsified. He makes sure the cargo is listed as something heavy, like lead or nails, but not so valuable that it attracts unwanted attention. This also has the side effect of making the engineer underestimate the train's true weight, making a derailment more likely. His second move is to be on that train. He gets himself into the cab with the engineer, Elias Thorne. Maybe he's posing as a superior officer. Maybe he's a special courier from Richmond. He has papers. He has authority. No one questions him. Now, he's in control. His objective is not to rob the train while it's moving. His objective is to make sure the train never reaches its destination. He needs a crash, but not just any crash. He needs it to happen at a very specific place, a place he has prepared, the washed-out track just before the bridge. Was it really an act of nature? Or did the architect and his team spend the day before the storm with shovels, deliberately weakening the embankment, creating a trap that would be perfectly hidden by the rising floodwaters? It's diabolically clever. The storm provides the perfect cover story. Who would suspect sabotage when the weather itself is a weapon of mass destruction? So the architect rides in the cab, watching the miles tick by. He knows exactly where the trap is. A few miles out, he makes his excuse. He needs to check on the cargo or speak to the guards. He leaves the cab, leaving Thorne to drive blindly into the prearranged disaster. The train crashes, exactly as planned. The chaos, the fire, the explosion, it's all part of the misdirection, the perfect distraction. While the Confederate authorities are in a panic, trying to organize a rescue and recovery in the middle of a flooded river, the architect's team is already at work. But they aren't at the river. That's the beauty of the plan. You don't need to steal the gold from the river if the gold was never in the river to begin with. Let's rewind. The train makes an unscheduled stop. Maybe just for a few minutes, in a secluded stretch of woods a few miles before the crash site. The architect, using his authority, orders the stop. Engine trouble, he'll say. His team is waiting with wagons. In the pouring rain, under the cover of darkness, they don't unload all the gold. That would take too long. They unload just one or two key crates, the most valuable ones. The ones filled with bullion, not coins. They replace the crates with identical ones, filled with something of similar weight. Lead bars, stones, anything to maintain the illusion. Then, the train starts up again and proceeds to its doom. The authorities dredge the river for weeks, looking for gold that is already miles away, rattling in the back of a wagon on its way to a port in Savannah or a Union-controlled territory. It's a masterpiece of criminal engineering. It explains the missing gold. It explains the mysterious man in the cab. It explains the convenient track failure. It's a perfect theory, except for one thing: the bodies. The men who died in that crash didn't know they were part of a heist. They thought they were serving their country. Their deaths were real. Their suffering was real. And if you believe the stories that started to surface a few years later, their anger was real too. If someone took the gold, they left something else behind, something that wouldn't stay buried in the mud of the Ocmulgee River. The war ended. The South was broken, and the memory of the lost gold became just one more scar on a landscape of defeat. The wreckage of the train was eventually salvaged for scrap metal, and the river reclaimed its banks. For a few years, the story of the crash was just a sad local memory. And then, people started seeing things. It began with fishermen, men who would be out on the river at night, checking their lines. They would report a strange, cold spot on the water, even in the heat of a Georgia summer. Then they'd hear a sound, the faint hiss of steam carried on the wind. In the 1870s, a family having a picnic on the riverbank on a clear April afternoon claimed to have heard the distinct sound of a train whistle, followed by a scream. They looked around. There were no tracks nearby. The nearest line was 5 miles away. The stories grew. People traveling on the road near the old trestle site would see a single bright light moving through the woods where no light should be. Horses would get spooked, rearing up and refusing to go further. By the 1880s, the story had a name, the Ghost Train of Macon, and it had a schedule. It only appeared in the second week of April, the anniversary of the crash. Why does a story like this start? Is it just folklore? A way for a traumatized community to process a horrific event? Psychologists and paranormal researchers have a term for this kind of phenomenon. It's called a residual haunting. Imagine an old cassette tape. You can record sound onto it, and you can play it back. The tape itself isn't alive. It doesn't have a soul. It's just holding an echo of energy. There's a theory, it's just a theory, but a compelling one called stone tape theory. The idea is that powerful traumatic events can release a kind of psychic energy, and that energy can be recorded onto the physical environment. The rocks, the water, the trees. The crash of the Macon train was an event of almost unimaginable trauma. The terror of the passengers, the agony of the soldiers, the sheer violence of the impact and the explosion. It was a perfect storm of negative energy, all focused on one small spot on the river. According to this theory, the ghost train isn't a collection of spirits with unfinished business. It's an echo, a recording of the final moments of the crash, playing back on a loop, triggered by the atmospheric conditions of the anniversary each year. This explains why the apparition is always the same. The light, the sound of the crash, the splash. It's a recording. It can't interact with you. It can't hurt you. It's just a tragic movie playing in the woods. This explanation is almost comforting. It makes the ghost a predictable, natural phenomenon, something you can explain away with fringe science, and that's what most people believed for 30 years. They treated the ghost train as a local curiosity, a spooky story to tell your kids, nothing to be taken seriously. Until the night of April 14th, 1904, the 40th anniversary of the disaster. That was the night a perfectly sane, sober, and experienced railroad engineer almost killed 200 people because he saw a ghost. By 1904, the world had changed. The Civil War was a distant memory, a story told by old men. Railroads were no longer rickety death traps. They were the lifeblood of American industry. Engines were bigger, faster, and safer. James Sully Sullivan was a man of this new era. He was a 20-year veteran of the Southern Railway. He was a man of routine and regulation. He didn't believe in ghosts. He believed in timetables and brake pressure. On the night of April 14th, he was at the throttle of the Crescent Limited, a passenger express running from New Orleans to New York. He had 200 sleeping passengers behind him. He was running on a new, modern line that passed about half a mile from the site of the old 1864 wreck. It was a clear, moonlit night. He was on schedule, making good time. As he rounded a long curve a few miles south of the Ocmulgee River, he saw a light in the distance. This was not unusual. It was likely another train waiting at a siding. But as he got closer, he realized something was wrong. The light was old-fashioned, a weak, flickering yellow, not the bright, steady electric beam of a modern locomotive. And it was moving. It was on his track, coming straight at him. Sully's blood ran cold, a head-on collision, the single greatest fear of every locomotive engineer. He blew his whistle, a long, frantic blast, the signal for an approaching train to get off the track. The oncoming light didn't react. It just kept coming, growing brighter. He could see the shape of the engine now. It was small, antiquated, with a huge smokestack. It looked like something out of a museum. Sully screamed at his fireman to jump. He grabbed the emergency brake handle and pulled it with all his strength. The effect was instantaneous and violent. 200 tons of steel locked up. Sparks, thick as a welder's torch, showered from the wheels. The passengers were thrown from their berths, jolted awake by a sound like the train was being torn apart. The Crescent Limited screeched, groaned, and finally shuddered to a halt, the smell of burning steel filling the air. Sully stood there, heart pounding, braced for the impact. He stared out the window, waiting for the crash, and saw nothing. The track ahead of him was empty. The mysterious locomotive was gone. There was no wreckage, no smoke, no sound except the panicked shouts of his passengers. The conductor came running up to the engine. "Sully, what in God's name happened? Are you all right?" Sully just pointed a shaking finger at the empty track. "There was a train," he stammered. "Right there, an old 440. It was coming right at us. They searched for an hour. The crew, the passengers, everyone. They walked up and down the line with lanterns. They found no signs of another train, no debris, no oil on the tracks, nothing." The official inquiry was a humiliating ordeal for Sully. He was a respected engineer, a man with a perfect record. Now he was sitting in front of a board of inquiry, telling them he had stopped his train to avoid a collision with a ghost. The board had two options. Either their most senior engineer was a liar, or he was insane. A third option, that he was telling the truth, was unthinkable. It would mean the laws of physics, the very foundation of their rational, industrial world, were wrong. They concluded he had seen a reflection, or the light from a farmer's lantern, and had panicked. Or worse, that he had fallen asleep at the throttle and invented the story to cover his mistake. James Sullivan was fired. He lost his job, his pension, his reputation. He moved away and lived the rest of his life in obscurity, ridiculed as the man who saw a phantom train. But until the day he died, his story never changed. He swore on a Bible that the track in front of him was occupied by a train that had no right to exist, and that if he hadn't slammed on the brakes, 200 people would have died. His story changed the legend. The ghost train was no longer a harmless echo. It was interactive. It was dangerous. It seemed to be trying to cause another crash, to drag more souls down into the river with it. The question was no longer, what is it? The question became, what does it want? The 1904 incident fundamentally altered the ghost story. It was no longer a passive replay of a tragedy. It was an active, malevolent force. The storytellers of Macon and the surrounding counties began to weave a new narrative. The ghosts of the Confederate soldiers weren't just haunting the river, they were guarding it. Think about it from the perspective of a dead soldier. You were entrusted with the last hope of your nation. You were betrayed, murdered, and your sacred cargo was stolen. Your body was left to rot in the mud. You were a footnote in a forgotten war. What would you feel? Rage, a burning, eternal sense of duty unfulfilled. And so, the legend evolved. The spirits of the dead were now bound to the river, cursed to protect the place where the gold was last seen. They became the spectral guardians of an empty vault. This new version of the story served a purpose. It was a warning. Don't go looking for the gold. And people did look. Throughout the 20th century, the story of the lost Confederate gold became a siren song for treasure hunters, adventurers, and con artists. They would arrive in Macon with old maps, fancy new metal detectors, and wild theories. Most of them left with nothing but empty pockets and mosquito bites. But some of them didn't leave at all. The local police records are filled with strange incidents around the old crash site. In the 1950s, a prospector from California was found wandering delirious on a nearby road, suffering from severe hypothermia on a warm summer night. He claimed cold hands had dragged him into the river. In the 1970s, a team with semi-professional dredging equipment had to abandon their search after a series of bizarre mechanical failures. Their engine pumps seized up. Their boat's engine flooded for no reason. One of the men swore he saw faces in the water looking up at him from the riverbed. These could all be dismissed as accidents. Rivers are dangerous places. Old equipment breaks down. But the story of the three teenagers from 1986 is harder to explain away. They were high school kids, fueled by bravado and local ghost stories. On the anniversary of the crash, they took a small boat out onto the river at midnight, determined to see the ghost train for themselves. According to the two survivors, they found the spot where the old trestle used to be. The air grew cold. They heard a whistle. And then, a wave of sheer, paralyzing terror washed over them. Not just fear, but a feeling of pure hatred directed at them from the darkness. They panicked. In the confusion, their small boat capsized. Two of them managed to swim to the shore, scrambling through the mud and brambles, not stopping until they reached the nearest farmhouse. The third, a boy named Michael, was not with them. A search was launched the next day. They searched the river downstream, assuming the current had carried him. They found nothing. 3 days later, a fisherman found Michael's body. But it wasn't downstream. It was nearly 2 miles upstream, snagged on a fallen log. It was a physical impossibility. The Ocmulgey's current is strong. Nothing and no one floats upstream. The coroner's report listed the cause of death as drowning. But the sheriff, a man who had lived in Macon his whole life, wrote a single cryptic note in the margin of the case file. The river keeps what it's owed. The story was now complete. The ghost train was a lure, a phantom light in the darkness, drawing the greedy and the foolish to their doom. And the guardian ghosts were the enforcers, ensuring that whatever secret lay at the bottom of that river stayed there. For decades, this was the accepted truth. The gold was down there, and the dead were protecting it. But what if the ghosts weren't guarding the gold? What if they were guarding the truth? Accidents happen. Rivers are dangerous. But what happened to a professional diver in 1995 defies all rational explanation. In the mid-1990s, the Georgia Department of Transportation was planning to widen the modern highway bridge that crossed the Ocmulgey River, not far from the original crash site. Before construction could begin, they needed to do a thorough structural survey of the existing bridge pylons. This is a routine job. They hired a commercial diver named Frank Miller. Frank was not a treasure hunter or a ghost enthusiast. He was a professional, a former Navy diver. He was a man who spent his life in dark, dangerous water. He was not easily spooked. The job was simple. Dive down to the base of the concrete pylons, inspect them for cracks or erosion, and film the whole thing with an underwater camera. The water in the Ocmulgey is notoriously murky. Visibility is almost zero. Diving there is like swimming through cold black coffee. You don't see with your eyes, you see with your hands. Frank descended into the darkness, tethered to his support team by a communications line and an air hose. The only sounds were the hiss of his regulator and his own steady breathing. He reached the base of the first pylon and began his inspection, running his gloved hands over the cold concrete. Everything was normal. He moved to the second pylon. Again, normal. His job site was located about 100 yards downstream from the estimated location of the 1864 wreck. He wasn't thinking about the ghost train. He was thinking about concrete stress fractures and water turbidity. And then his comm line crackled. "Frank, you've got a lot of metal debris on the sonar down there. Be careful you don't get snagged." Frank acknowledged the call. He knew the river bottom was littered with junk. Old cars, shopping carts, and maybe, just maybe, some forgotten pieces of a 130-year-old train. He finished his inspection of the third pylon and started moving toward the fourth. This path took him directly over the deep channel where the train was believed to have gone down. The mud here was different, softer, deeper. His boots sank into it. He felt something brush against his leg. He stopped. It wasn't a fish. It wasn't a log. It felt like fingers. He told himself it was just a submerged tree branch, its twigs scraping his suit. He kept moving. Then he felt it again, a distinct, deliberate tug on his ankle. His heart rate spiked. He aimed his camera's light down at his feet, but the beam was swallowed by the silt he had kicked up. He couldn't see a thing. He spoke into his comm. "Hey, I think I'm snagged on something down here." His voice was tight, trying to sound professional. His topside supervisor replied, "All right, Frank, hold still. Don't struggle. We'll check your line." But Frank knew it wasn't his line. The tugging became more insistent. It wasn't one hand anymore. It felt like multiple hands, gripping his legs, trying to pull him down into the mud. Panic began to set in, the primal claustrophobic terror of being trapped underwater. He kicked out, trying to free himself. His boot connected with something solid, yet soft, something that yielded like flesh. And then, through the hiss of his regulator, he heard a sound that shouldn't be possible underwater, a faint, bubbling murmur. It sounded like voices, whispering. That's when he lost control. He screamed into his comm, "Pull me up! Pull me up now!" His support team, hearing the sheer terror in his voice, began hauling on his tether. Frank clawed at the water, fighting against the unseen things that were now pulling him back with surprising strength. He felt a searing pain in his calf as something sharp scraped against him. He was reeled to the surface like a fish, breaking through into the daylight, gasping and screaming. His crew pulled him onto the boat. He tore off his helmet, his eyes wild with terror. "They're down there!" he yelled. "They're still down there, in the mud!" His crew thought he had the bends, that he was hallucinating from nitrogen narcosis. But when they removed his dive suit, they saw the evidence. On his calf were 3 long parallel scratches, deep enough to have drawn blood through the thick neoprene of his suit. And wedged into the sole of his dive boot was a small, metallic object. It was tarnished and bent, but unmistakable. It was a Confederate Army belt buckle. Frank Miller quit his job that day. He refused to ever enter the Ocmulgee River again. His official report cited hazardous underwater debris, but everyone on that boat knew what he really meant. He never dove again. But his description of what he saw and what he felt matches a document found in a dusty attic in Atlanta just last year. A document that changes everything we thought we knew about that night in 1864. History is not a static thing. It's a living, breathing story that can change with the discovery of a single piece of paper. For over a century, the story of the Macon ghost train was based on official records, newspaper clippings, and folklore. But in 2022, a historian from Emory University was digging through a box of unsorted Civil War documents donated by the estate of a former Confederate quartermaster. Most of it was boring, receipts for hay, ammunition inventories. But then he found it. It was a small, leather-bound ledger, the kind a clerk would use to keep daily records. The pages were brittle, the ink faded to a rusty brown, and one entry, dated April 14, 1864, stopped him cold. This wasn't an official military document. It was a private log, a man's personal notes, and because it was private, it was honest. The entry described the chaos at the Macon depot on the night the train left. It mentioned the storm, the security, the sense of desperation, and then it detailed the cargo. At first, it seemed to confirm the legend. The ledger listed crate after crate of gold bullion and silver coin, along with their estimated weights. But then there was a second entry, made later that night, timed at just before the train's departure. This entry described a last-minute change of plans, an order delivered by a Major Harrison who does not appear on any official Confederate roster. This mysterious major ordered that one of the boxcars be uncoupled from the main train. The ledger is specific. It was the second-to-last car, a heavy, reinforced car that the clerk noted was carrying the primary asset, the gold. According to this secret ledger, the vast majority of the treasure was taken off the train moments before it departed. It was diverted to a secondary, smaller train on a different track, headed not north toward the fighting, but south toward the coast. The train that crashed into the Ocmulgee River was still carrying some valuables, yes. A few boxes of silver coins, the personal effects of the officials. Enough to make the manifest seem legitimate. But its primary cargo wasn't gold. Its primary cargo was deception. It was a decoy. A sacrificial lamb sent roaring into the night to draw attention away from the real treasure. This single entry reframes the entire story. The crash wasn't a failed heist. It was a successful diversion. The architect, this Major Harrison, wasn't trying to steal the gold. He was trying to save it. He orchestrated the crash, sacrificing the train and the men on board to create a public, spectacular disaster that would make the Union Army and any potential thieves believe the Confederate treasury was at the bottom of a river. It was a brutal, cynical, but brilliant act of military strategy. But the ledger contained one more horrifying detail. The final page of the entry for that night wasn't about cargo. It was titled Macon Dispatch, Asset Relocation. And it wasn't a list of gold crates, it was a list of names. There were 32 names on that list. Next to each name was a rank, and next to that, a single word, terminated. These were the names of the soldiers, the engineers, and the railroad workers who knew the truth. The men who had loaded the real gold onto the other train. The men who had witnessed the change of plans. They were loose ends, and according to a scribbled note at the bottom of the page, they were all assigned to guard the decoy train, the one heading for the Ocmulgee River. This changes everything. The crash wasn't just a diversion, it was a mass execution. The men on that train weren't victims of an accident. They were targets. They were put on that train specifically to die, to take the secret of the real gold to their graves. And suddenly, the ghost story makes a completely new kind of sense. If the ledger is true, then the ghosts aren't guarding treasure. They are not waiting for their stolen gold to be returned. They are guarding a crime scene, their own. With this new evidence, the scattered pieces of the puzzle, the history, the folklore, the eyewitness accounts snap into a single, terrifying picture. Let's reconstruct the events of April 14th, 1864, not as a ghost story, but as a Black Ops military mission. The mission objective: save the Confederate treasury at all costs. The architect: the mysterious Major Harrison. He's likely a high-ranking intelligence officer, a man comfortable with deception and collateral damage. His plan has two parts. Phase 1 is the switch. Under the cover of the storm and the chaos at the Macon depot, he oversees the loading of the gold. But at the last minute, he stages a reorganization. He moves the real treasure to a different train, a smaller, faster one that slips away south unnoticed. But he has a problem. Witnesses. The men who moved the gold. The station hands who saw the switch. The guards assigned to the original cargo. There are dozens of them. In a war, secrets get you killed. But men who know secrets get you killed faster. So he initiates Phase 2, the cleanup. He gathers all the witnesses, the 32 men from the ledger, under one pretext. They are the honor guard. They are being given the crucial task of escorting the treasury north. It's a suicide mission, but they don't know it. They are loaded onto the decoy train. The train is deliberately overloaded, its manifest falsified to ensure the engineer, Elias Thorne, will push it too hard. Thorne is not a conspirator. He is a pawn, another victim. Major Harrison himself gets into the cab. He's the second man the farmer Jedediah Blackwood saw. He's not there to supervise. He's there to ensure the plan goes off without a hitch. He needs to make sure Thorne gets the train up to a speed from which it cannot recover, and he needs to confirm the trap is set. His own men, hours earlier, had gone to the Ocmulgee trestle and dug out the embankment beneath the tracks. A simple act of sabotage that the floodwaters would perfectly conceal. The train thunders into the night. It's a ghost train even before it crashes. A train full of dead men who just don't know it yet. A few miles from the bridge, Harrison makes his exit. He jumps from the slowing train, or perhaps has a horse waiting for him. His job is done. The fuse is lit. Elias Thorne, alone in the cab, drives the train into the trap. The derailment, the crash, the explosion. It all happens exactly as Harrison planned. The crash wasn't an accident. It was the cleanup. It's a perfect, brutal solution. In a single fiery event, Harrison has achieved three things. He has created a highly visible public tragedy that convinces everyone the gold is lost in the river. He has physically eliminated every single witness to his real plan. And he has created a dramatic story that will be told for generations, a ghost story that keeps people away from the scene of his crime. Now think about the paranormal events from this perspective. The ghost train isn't a residual echo of a tragedy. It's a psychic scream of betrayal, the rage of 32 men who realized in their final terrifying seconds that they were not dying for their country. They were being murdered by it. The guardian ghosts aren't protecting gold. They are pointing to the crime. They are trying to show us what happened. James Sullivan, the engineer in 1904, didn't see an aggressive spirit trying to cause a crash. He saw a warning, a phantom train appearing on the tracks to say, "Stop! Danger ahead! This is what happened to us." And the diver, Frank Miller. What if the hands he felt weren't trying to pull him down? What if they were trying to give him something? The belt buckle, a piece of evidence, a plea from the grave saying, "Look closer, find the truth. We have the motive, the brutal logic of war. We have the method, a masterful plan of deception and murder." But the river kept the bodies, and for over a century, it kept the secret. So the obvious question is, why can't we just go and prove it? Why can't we take a modern forensics team to the Ocmulgee River, excavate the site, and find the remains of the decoy train and its murdered crew? The answer is the river itself. The Ocmulgee River of today is not the Ocmulgee River of 1864. A river is a living thing. It breathes, it moves, it changes its shape. In the 160 years since the crash, the river has flooded hundreds of times. Each flood deposits a new layer of silt, sand, and mud on the riverbed. The site of the wreck is now buried under an estimated 15 to 20 feet of sediment. That's like digging through a two-story building made of mud. Furthermore, the river has changed its course. The deep channel where the train went down is no longer the deepest part of the river. The banks have eroded in some places and built up in others. The exact location, once known to every local, is now a matter of educated guesswork. And even if you could pinpoint the location, excavation would be an environmental and legal nightmare. The area is now a protected wetland. Bringing in the kind of heavy industrial equipment needed to dig that deep, barges, cranes, cofferdams, would require an army of engineers and a mountain of permits. It would risk destroying a delicate ecosystem. The river has become the perfect accomplice to the crime, silently burying the evidence deeper and deeper with each passing year. So where did the real gold go? The most likely theory is that the second train took it south to the port of Savannah. From there, it was probably loaded onto a blockade runner, a fast ship designed to evade the Union Navy. Its destination, Europe. The Confederacy was desperate for foreign allies. A few $1 million in gold could have bought them guns from France or ships from Great Britain. It was a last, desperate gamble to turn the tide of the war. Did it work? Almost certainly not. By April of 1864, the war was already lost. The gold likely ended up in a European bank vault, its origins obscured, absorbed into the global financial system. The last hope of the Confederacy probably paid for a French vineyard or a British country estate. The gold is likely long gone, untraceable. But the evidence of the crime, the bones of the men who were murdered, are almost certainly still there, buried in the cold, dark mud of the Ocmulgee. Frank Miller, the diver, may have been the last person to come into direct contact with them. The scratches on his leg, the belt buckle in his boot, a final, desperate message from the bottom of the river. A message that says, We are still here. Do not forget us. The mystery of the ghost train of Macon is, in the end, two stories woven together. The first is a story of lost gold, a classic treasure hunt. But the second, deeper story is a murder mystery. It's a story about the true cost of war, where loyalty is a weapon and human lives are just another resource to be spent. So, the gold is gone. The soldiers are dead. But if you stand on that bank tonight, on a quiet April evening, you have to wonder. When you hear that phantom whistle blowing on the wind, are you hearing an echo of the past? Or are you hearing a warning for the future? Every town has a ghost story, a haunted house, a spooky old road. We tell these stories for entertainment, to feel a shiver run down our spine in the safety of our own homes. But the ghost train of Macon is different. It's more than just a campfire tale. It's a living piece of history, a mystery that has endured for over a century and a half, fueled by whispers, sightings, and the tantalizing promise of lost treasure. We began this journey looking for a simple ghost, an echo of a tragic accident. But the truth we've uncovered is far more complex and far more human. It's a story born from the desperation of a dying nation. A story of a brilliant, ruthless plan to save a fortune by sacrificing human lives. It's a heist, a diversion, and a mass murder, all disguised as a simple train wreck. The phantom locomotive that people see is not just a replay of an event. It's the psychic scar left on the landscape by an act of profound betrayal. The soldiers on that train thought they were dying for a cause. Instead, they were silenced, their deaths used as a tool of deception by the very leaders they trusted. Their story was buried, first under the muddy waters of the Ocmulgee River, and then under the weight of history itself. The official record calls it an accident. But the legend, the ghost story that refused to die, kept a different version of the truth alive. The folklore was right. It always hinted that something was wrong with the official story. It told us the river was guarded. It told us the spirits were restless. We thought they were angry about stolen gold, but they were angry about stolen lives, their own. This is the enduring power of such legends. They are the folk history of the forgotten. When the official documents are sanitized, when the truth is deliberately obscured, the ghosts are sometimes the only ones left to testify. The real treasure wasn't the gold. The real treasure was the truth. And it's a truth that forces us to look at history not as a set of clean facts, but as a messy, often brutal story of human choices. The gold is gone. The war is over. The men who orchestrated the deception are long dead. All that remains is the river, the mud, and the story. A story that still gets told in the dark, on the banks of the Ocmulgee, every April. Some say history is written by the victors. In Macon, history is whispered by the dead. And they haven't finished talking yet.